A well-dressed black man walked into a bank to check on his account. Just another day, just another errand. But what happened next would expose a level of quiet discrimination most people never see. Staff ignored him, laughed at his balance, and told him to leave, without ever knowing who he truly was. And just 72 hours later, their entire institution was on the brink of collapse. What he did in silence changed everything. Stay with me. This is one story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? And if this story moves you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories that reveal the truth behind the curtain. It all started with one man and a lobby that thought it could decide his worth. The sun was high over Madison Avenue, but inside the lobby of Ferris and Holt Financial, it was all glass and shadow, an illusion of openness, a performance of elegance. Tobias Reed stepped in from the street, collar damp from the city's damp heat, a leather folio tucked under his arm, like a compass no one else knew how to read. He didn't walk like someone lost. He walked like someone who'd already arrived and didn't need to explain why. The air inside was cool, antiseptic. Jazz drifted from hidden speakers, but the notes were hollow, music that didn't know sorrow, only structure. Tobias stood in the middle of the marble floor, glanced at the velvet ropes, and moved toward the sign that read Private Clients. He knew where he was going. He had walked through far heavier doors than this. But he had not taken 2 steps before the first man appeared, a security guard named Randall, tall and lean, the kind of man who stood like he'd been taught to see danger in the shape of brown skin. Randall didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. That was the trick. "Sir," he said, one hand gesturing toward the other line. "This one's reserved." "I know," Tobias replied evenly, not stepping back, not stepping forward. "I have business regarding my trust." Randall didn't ask to see my ID. He didn't ask any questions. He simply gestured again, firmer now, more final. "You'll need to wait over there." And Tobias, who had seen war and courtroom benches, oil fields and open graves, didn't argue. He simply stood his ground. Not out of defiance. Out of clarity. He knew what this was. A script written long before either of them were born. They were simply reciting their parts. The glass doors behind him opened. A woman entered in white, wealth draped in polish. She didn't walk. She swept. And the receptionist lit up like a marquee. "Welcome back, Ms. Brighton," she sang. "Can I offer you a Pellegrino?" The drink appeared without request. The smile without thought. The access without delay. Tobias watched it all, not bitter, not surprised. Just aware. He stood in line while others passed. A businessman in a custom suit. A couple with a trust fund in the child's name before she could spell it. An intern with a laptop and blonde ambition. Each glided past him like he was part of the architecture. He waited. 15 minutes passed like centuries. And then Randall came back. "You'll need to go to the Hayes Street branch," he said, tone flat like concrete. Business accounts of that nature aren't handled here. No forms had been filled. No numbers taken. Just a decision wrapped in policy. A performance of neutrality masking a practiced exclusion. Tobias nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition. He turned, walked, and just before the doors closed behind him, his phone buzzed. One message, one tap, and then silence. The bank thought they had sent him away. They hadn't. They had invited something far more complicated through their own front door. What they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, is that Tobias Reed wasn't here to be served. He was here to listen, to measure, to let the system hang itself by its own velvet rope. And outside, under the glass towers, the city kept moving, unaware that something had shifted. Quietly, deliberately, irreversibly. Tobias did not go home. Men like Tobias rarely go home after a wound. They walk. They study the air. They let the silence speak, for in it lies more truth than most men can bear. And as he turned the corner from Ferris and Holt Financial, Past the whispering glass storefronts that sell dreams and mirrors in equal measure, he wasn't thinking of revenge. He was thinking of gravity, the kind that pulls on dignity every day and makes a man heavy with memory. By the time the sun slid behind a curtain of gray, Tobias had already returned, not in body but in force. An assistant at Ferris and Holt received a call that same evening. The voice on the other end was polite. No accent. No emotion. Just a question. Who do I speak to regarding institutional restructuring? The assistant stammered, unsure, transferred the call upward, then upward again, until it found a voicemail and a gatekeeper trained to miss what mattered most. Meanwhile, the bank prepared for another ordinary day. The following morning, Tobias returned. Same suit. Same folio. Different air. He entered with the grace of a man who had no reason to raise his voice, because the weight of his silence had already done the lifting. The lobby felt smaller this time, the ceilings lower. The music, the same cold jazz, now sounded like a lie too old to keep telling. At counter 3 stood a man named Conrad Sloan, senior account executive, age 41, educated at Yale, trained at Chase, and polished by a world that rewarded charm over character. His tie was red, his teeth white, and his eyes, when they lifted to see Tobias approach, registered surprise, but not the kind that honors. The kind that measures. Conrad greeted him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. How can I help you today, sir? Tobias gave his name and a request to speak with someone regarding asset structuring. His voice was calm, even, like a courtroom before the verdict. Conrad began typing. And then he stopped. His expression shifted, barely, but enough. Enough to suggest he had seen the number. Or rather, the absence of one. You're looking to set up a trust? He asked, voice dipped in condescension. Typically, that kind of service is reserved for higher-tier clients. Tobias did not flinch. He offered documentation, clean, legal, irrefutable. Conrad didn't take it. He leaned back and said, to be honest, most of our clients in that range don't require institutional handling. You might find better service at our community branch down on Lincoln. There it was. The quiet betrayal. Wrapped in courtesy. Delivered with a practiced tongue. No slur, no shout, just a door closing without ever having been seen open. It's how racism survives in America, Tobias thought. Not in the bark of the Old South, but in the shrug of the New North. Not in chains, but in procedure. A woman behind Tobias in line shifted. She looked up from her phone, then quickly back down. A child glanced toward him, then to his mother, who whispered, "Don't stare." An elderly man in a golf cap looked away as if watching justice denied might somehow stain his conscience. Tobias inhaled, slowly. "I'd still like to proceed," he said. Conrad sighed, but smiled as if granting a favor. "All right, but don't be surprised if our team can't prioritize a review this week. We have a strict triage system." He typed with theatrical slowness, each keystroke meant to diminish. Tobias waited. 10 minutes later, Conrad printed a form, one meant for clients without appointments. A placeholder. A stall. He slid it across the desk with a pen and said, "Fill this out. Someone might be in touch." Tobias looked at the form, then looked at Conrad. "Is this your official refusal to notify the institutional team?" Conrad blinked. The question landed like a gavel. He stammered, then recovered. "No, of course not. Just protocol." Tobias placed the form back, untouched. "Then I'd like the documentation of this conversation noted in your system." Conrad hesitated. "We don't usually log inquiries unless they result in an active file." There it was again. The vanishing trick. The bureaucratic broom sweeping bias beneath the floorboards. Not here. Not now. Not recorded. A young teller named Amina, barely 23, black like Tobias, but young enough to still believe in the idea of fairness, heard everything. Her face shifted, unsure. Her fingers paused above the keyboard. She said nothing, because in institutions like these, silence is safer than solidarity. Tobias stood. He did not argue. He did not beg. He did not raise his voice. He simply nodded once, turned, and walked toward the reception desk. This time, he asked to speak with someone from executive services. The woman behind the desk, white, polished, and trained to smile like glass, transparent but fragile, looked up at him for the first time. She hesitated, then asked for his name again. He gave it. Her fingers paused. Her face changed, because somewhere, deep in the system, a flag had risen. Not the kind that waves in protest, but the kind that signals an anomaly, an inconsistency. A client who didn't match the profile, but not for lack of credentials. For surplus. I see, she said quietly. Please wait here. Tobias stepped aside. He didn't lean. He didn't pace. He stood like a monument the world had tried to forget. And around him, the room moved. Clients came and went. Screens blinked. Phones rang. But nothing in that room moved Tobias. Because he had seen this theater before. In schools that failed the gifted. In hospitals that dismissed the breathless. In voting lines drawn to vanish black voices. It is always the same play, he thought. Different stages. Same ending. Except this time, Tobias had written the final scene himself. And the actors didn't know they were walking into his script. There is a kind of storm that builds without thunder. It gathers in silence, in the narrowing of eyes, in the soft shifting of posture, in the slight tightening of a jaw. That was the kind of storm Tobias Reed carried with him when he returned to Ferris and Holt the next day. Not with fury, but with presence. Not to make noise, but to confirm that silence had spoken clearly enough. The morning light poured through the glass walls of the bank, laying itself like truth across the polished marble floor. Tobias stepped in once more. Same folio, same quiet grace. But something was different. The eyes that once passed over him now hovered just a moment too long. Whispers, soft and hushed, rose and fell behind desks. A few remembered the name now. Reed. Tobias Reed. It rolled through the air like a rumor too powerful to remain unspoken. This time, he didn't wait for directions. He walked straight toward the executive wing, toward the offices where decisions were made behind glass and mahogany, where men like Conrad Sloan carried titles like armor and wore smiles like masks. But before he could reach the corridor, the same security guard, Randall, appeared once again, as though summoned by the very memory of exclusion. "Sir," he said, voice flat, "you can't proceed beyond this point without clearance." Tobias stopped, looked Randall in the eyes. "Is that written policy," he asked evenly, "or discretionary enforcement?" Randall hesitated, shifting on his heels. The question wasn't just procedural, it was historical. It echoed through the long halls of courthouses and lunch counters, through bus terminals and school steps, through every place where access had always depended on who was asking. And Randall knew it. "Still," he replied, "we've received a report that you were disruptive during your last visit. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." Around them, the lobby stilled. Conversations slowed. A man in a navy suit lowered his phone. A woman clutching a purse clutched it tighter. No one moved, but everyone watched. Tobias blinked slowly. "There was no disruption," he said. "Only discomfort." "Yours." Randall said nothing. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. The institution had made its choice. And it chose, as it always had, the comfort of its own fragility over the dignity of someone who refused to beg. Tobias turned his head slightly and saw a young woman near the copy machine, Alina, her name tag said. She watched with a look that hovered between duty and doubt. Their eyes met for only a second, but in that glance, she saw it, not a man defying rules, but a man exposing how shallow those rules had always been. He did not protest. He did not argue. He simply said, "Then let this moment be recorded. I am being removed without cause, not for what I did, but for what I made you feel." And with that, he walked out, once again. But the bank was no longer at ease. because it had miscalculated something ancient. That dignity, when wounded, does not retreat, it waits. And power, when unacknowledged, does not vanish, it prepares. That night, far from the polished lobbies and scripted apologies, in a quiet office with no logos and no flags, Marissa Lane reviewed her footage. A veteran journalist with silver in her hair and history in her bones, she watched what unfolded not as scandal, but as pattern. She had seen it before, in city halls and federal courthouses, in neighborhoods where truth had to shout just to be heard. The footage showed everything. Tobias's calm, the staff's indifference, the ease with which he was dismissed. And most damning of all, the glances, those glances that said he doesn't belong here, spoken not in words, but in the choreography of cowardice. She uploaded the footage, encrypted it, and sent it to her editor. The subject line read, "Power misread, prepare for release." Back at the bank, Conrad Sloan sat behind his desk sipping burnt coffee from a mug that said professional excellence, still smirking, still untouched. He didn't know yet that the storm he had invited in with a smirk was now circling back with a name. Tobias Reed. And behind him, systems began to flicker, silent alarms, not of emergency, but of accountability. At 7:16 a.m. the next morning, 3 simultaneous notifications triggered Ferris and Holt's highest-level compliance protocols. One from asset management, one from institutional relations, one from legal risk oversight, all tied to a single name, Tobias Reed. Not angry, not loud, just present. And in his presence, the bank began to remember what history had tried to forget, that some men, when forced into the margins, learn to write new chapters not with rage, but with precision. There comes a moment when a man stops knocking and begins listening to how the walls answer. Tobias Reed had learned long ago that institutions are not built to hear men like him, but they will echo his presence when silence no longer protects them. And on that 4th day, when he walked once more through the doors of Ferris and Holt, it wasn't as a customer. It was as a consequence. He wore a charcoal overcoat now, a suit sharper than memory, his folio still tucked neatly beneath his arm, like a verdict waiting for the courtroom. The lobby had not changed, the marble still gleamed, the glass still shimmered, the air still whispered superiority, but the temperature had. Quiet had become brittle. It was the receptionist who noticed him first. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. She didn't greet him. She didn't look away. She simply froze, caught between protocol and the unspoken truth that this man, this presence, was not to be treated as he had been before. Randall, the security guard, stepped forward almost on instinct. "Mr. Reed," he said cautiously, "I'm going to have to ask you." But Tobias raised his hand. Not to silence him. Not to confront him. Simply to remind the room who held control now. "I'm not here to ask," he said. "I'm here to deliver." He walked past Randall without force. The same way a tide moves past rocks, without permission. All around him, conversations dimmed. Executives on Bluetooth headsets glanced over their shoulders. Clients shifted in waiting chairs. The quiet had changed its shape. At counter 3, Conrad Sloan was already watching. He stood too quickly, smiled too fast. "Back again," he said with a feigned warmth that couldn't cover the tremor beneath it. Tobias said nothing. He placed a sealed envelope on the desk. It bore no logo. "Just wait." Conrad glanced at it, then backed up at him. "Are we delivering something today?" he asked, still trying to own the stage, still playing host in a theater no longer his. Tobias simply looked at him. And in that gaze, steady, unhurried, was the full indictment of a man who had believed himself immune. Conrad reached for the envelope, hesitated, then set it aside without opening it. "I'll have to route this to our operations team," he muttered. "Might take a few days." Tobias nodded once, turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, he paused. Slowly, he looked back, not at the guard, not at the ceiling, but directly at Conrad. The look was not angry. It was not even stern. It was surgical. The look of a man who no longer carried the burden of needing to be understood. Just the precision of being remembered. Across the lobby, a young woman, Amina, watched from behind the teller window. She did not look away this time, because something inside her had shifted too. Something about watching a man walk out of a place that had tried to diminish him without ever raising his voice. It took less than 2 hours for the envelope to reach compliance. And in those 2 hours, the branch began to tremble. The numbers inside the document did not match Tobias's face. And that was the problem. The account, flagged weeks ago as negligible, was now linked to 3 silent trusts, 2 international holdings, and a restructuring clause embedded in the financial bylaws of Ferris and Holt's parent company. Tobias Reed was not just a client. He was an owner. A quiet shareholder with voting rights embedded in legal language most of the branch's staff would never be allowed to read. The withdrawals began before the board could meet. Not loud. Not suddenly. Just deliberate. By 11:46 a.m., the first alert hit the central system. $87 million requested in 3 separate disbursements. By noon, a second trust moved a larger sum. By 12:14 p.m., the cumulative total passed $900 million. Ferris and Holt executives scrambled, conversations behind closed doors, calls routed through compliance, conference rooms occupied with men in expensive suits suddenly unsure of what they missed. Because what they had misjudged was not Tobias's account, it was the history that built it. He had walked into their institution like a man, and they treated him like a disruption. They didn't know he was in the institution. Meanwhile, back at the branch, Conrad Sloan had gone pale. He didn't speak. He didn't sit. He read the email 3 times, but the words didn't change. Tobias Reed. Beneficiary. Primary stakeholder. Institutional override protocol triggered. The receptionist received a call from corporate. Do not engage. Legal has taken over. Randall was told to stand down. Amina was summoned quietly to a manager's office, not to be reprimanded, but to be asked what she had seen. She told the truth. And the truth had its own rhythm now. Outside, the wind had picked up. The sky over the city dimmed into a steel blue. Somewhere in a newsroom downtown, Marissa Lane finished editing the footage. It was less than 90 seconds. But in those seconds, the world saw what it had tried to ignore. A black man asked to leave his own bank, his own building, by people who didn't bother to ask his name. The video would go live before the sun set. And once it did, Ferris and Holt would no longer be a name. It would be a case study, a parable, a reckoning. And Tobias Reed? He would not need to say another word. Because by then, the entire nation, especially the generation that had seen the back of the bus and the front lines of progress, would understand. This wasn't a story about money. This was about how the illusion of authority crumbles when it's forced to recognize the dignity it thought it had the power to deny. The old people, the ones who still remembered the weight of water hoses in Birmingham, the way a counter stool could turn a child into a symbol, the way language could cut without ever drawing blood, they would have seen it coming. Not because they were bitter. Because they had lived long enough to recognize the pattern, that in America, dignity is a quiet thing, and it is always the first to be asked to wait. By the time the video went live, it wasn't just a clip. It was a mirror. 90 seconds of stillness, condescension, and the orchestrated choreography of denial. Tobias Reed, standing, not begging. Preston Mathers, sneering without knowing why. Randall, executing orders not written down, but deeply memorized. No one said the word. But the word lived in every glance, every delay, every polite refusal. Race. The video struck like a needle to the heart of the institution. Not because it was loud, but because it was precise. A man denied not through shouts, but through systems. A man denied not because he broke the rules, but because he wasn't meant to know them. At Ferris and Holt, the panic began not in the lobby, but in the boardroom. Executives whispered across conference tables, watching their own security footage like strangers seeing ghosts. The name Tobias Reed now echoed through every office like scripture. And with it came shame, not the kind that shows in headlines, but the kind that hides in silence. The kind that older men, white and polished, feel when they realize the lie they've helped live. One man, Harold Beckman, regional manager, had seen the footage and paled. Not because he was surprised by what Preston had done, but because he had trained him to do exactly that, discreetly, smoothly, without liability. Harold had taught his staff how to read the room, which was code for read the skin. Now, that code had turned on him. Meanwhile, Tobias sat alone in his apartment, no press team, no advisors, no champagne. He simply watched the story unfold across headlines. Billionaire flagged as security risk at his own bank. Financial giant exposed in racial bias scandal. Power denied, power withdrawn. But none of the articles told the full story. Not the one Tobias lived. The one where the greatest wound was never the insult, it was the assumption. That he, a black man with generational vision, institutional power, and quiet wealth, could still be measured by the clothes he wore and the line he stood in. That afternoon, calls were made across the industry. Partners suspended contracts. Investors asked for audits. And somewhere in the Capitol, a subcommittee aide flagged Ferris and Holt for inclusion in a federal inquiry into discriminatory banking practices. No one admitted fault, not yet. But the tremble was real. At the branch, Preston Mathers was told to take leave. It wasn't punishment. It was a strategy. He left with his briefcase, his smugness cracked but not yet collapsed. What he didn't know was that the envelope Tobias had left bore more than instructions. It bore timelines. Authorizations already activated. Trusts already serving. And Randall, the guard, once so sure of his authority, now stood behind the velvet rope like a relic. He had enforced a line. Now he was the one watched. But the most telling shift came in the quiet gestures. Amina, the young teller, stepped into a private office to speak to HR, not a tattle, but to testify. She spoke of the moment she wanted to help but didn't. Of the look in Tobias's eyes that reminded her of her grandfather, who once told her, "They will never call it what it is, but you will feel it just the same." In that moment, she chose to break protocol and speak the truth. And elsewhere, far from the branch, in a modest office lined with case files and court transcripts, Marissa Lane sat down for a meeting with attorneys from the Harmonic Trust Initiative. She did not want credit. She wanted structure. She wanted to ensure this moment did not pass as a headline, but became a door. One of the lawyers, a black woman in her 60s, leaned forward and said, "We've been waiting for the right case. We've seen this for years. But no one ever listens unless the money walks out the door." Marissa nodded. Well, this time the money walked out and the world finally followed. And in that moment, across screens and boardrooms and late-night television clips, Tobias became more than a man. He became the answer to a question this country keeps asking with the wrong tone. What more do you people want? The answer? Dignity without delay. Access without suspicion. Humanity without negotiation. What Tobias wanted was not an apology. It was exposure. What he demanded was not comfort. It was a confrontation. Because racism in the 21st century doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it smiles while it sends you to the wrong line. And sometimes, just sometimes, a man walks quietly out of that line and sets the whole building on fire without ever striking a match. It is a strange thing to watch an empire stumble, not from the weight of protest, but from the burden of its own reflection. Ferris and Holt had spent decades constructing the illusion of neutrality. Marble floors, brushed steel, abstract art, inclusion statements laminated and framed in gold. But Tobias Reed had peeled back the laminate. And beneath it, the rot was old, familiar, and quiet. By sunrise the next day, Tobias had not spoken a word to the press. But his silence had become louder than any headline. In corporate towers and suburban kitchens, people watched the footage over coffee and remembered something they didn't want to admit, that the racism of their youth had not vanished. It had simply adapted. It had learned to wear suits, smile politely, and deny through procedure. In those hours before the market opened, Ferris and Holt executives gathered for an emergency call. The boardroom was glass high above the city, but no one admired the view. The CEO, a man named Brennan Kessler with silver hair and a cautious tongue, tapped a pen against a stack of printed statements. "This is not about one employee," he said, trying to contain the leak before it became a flood. "We've had no formal complaint." But one director, a black woman named Lila Granger, cut through his comfort like a blade. "We don't need a complaint. We need a confession." The room fell still. Meanwhile, back at the branch, clients arrived with the same routines: mortgage questions, retirement transfers, small talk about the weather. But beneath the normalcy, tension hummed. The tellers whispered. The assistant manager sat stiffly at his desk, fielding call after call from clients asking for clarification, cancellation, and in some cases, explanations. Amina watched it all from her station, her hands steady now. She had done what so many before her had been afraid to do: tell the truth before it was convenient. And now she was no longer invisible. Her voice had made it into the report sent to legal. Her memory of Tobias's treatment had become a line of record. She didn't feel proud. She felt responsible. That afternoon, something else changed. A package arrived. Not to the branch, but to the home office. It was slim. Black folder. No return label. Inside, a single-page memorandum. A directive from the Harmonic Trust Initiative. It listed withdrawal protocols, outlined legal oversight violations, and carried signatures from attorneys the bank didn't even know were watching. It ended with one sentence: "This is not an exit. This is an audit of your soul." By 3:42 p.m., the bank's PR team was on the phone with crisis consultants. Preston Mathers, now officially placed on administrative leave, had deleted his social media and disconnected his phone. He had become a symbol, unintended, unprepared, and completely recognizable. People knew that face. The smirk of assumption. The jawline of certainty. The posture of a man who had never been forced to question the architecture of his own privilege. Meanwhile, in a quiet suburb not far from the chaos, Tobias sat in a modest room filled with books. Not trophies. Not paintings. Just texts on law, history, and systems. He wasn't celebrating. He was preparing. Because he knew the fire was only beginning. What had happened at the bank was not the final act. It was a page in a longer book. A chapter in the American contradiction. He remembered his grandfather's voice, slow, gravel-worn, and unshaken. "You can't shame a house built without mirrors, boy. You gotta break a window and let the air in." Tobias had done more than break a window. He had changed the oxygen. By evening, television hosts debated the footage. Conservative voices called it misinterpreted. Progressives called for Preston's resignation. But Tobias, if asked, would have said neither went far enough. Because the story wasn't about Preston. Preston was a symptom. The disease was systemic discretion, the belief that racism must be loud to be real. It was not loud when they denied his access. It was not loud when they redirected his service. It was not loud when they erased his dignity with a smile. It was quiet, professional, deadly. That night, an email leaked. An internal memo from Ferris and Holt leadership urging staff to remain composed in the face of recent scrutiny. The language was sterile. The message is clear: do not admit guilt. Control the narrative. But narratives, Tobias knew, are not controlled. They are exposed. And the truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. At 10:17 p.m., a second video surfaced, recorded by a bystander. Not Marissa. A client. White. Middle-aged. The clip showed Tobias being escorted out. It captured the silence of the staff. The indifference of the room. And most damning of all, the child's voice, soft, confused, asking, "Why are they making that man leave?" The child didn't know about protocols. He only saw unfairness. And in that voice, raw and unrehearsed, America heard itself. Because when you are 65 or 70 or older, you remember that voice. You remember asking the same question. In a different room. At a different time. About a different man. And the tragedy is that the answer still hasn't changed. It had been nearly a week since Tobias Reed walked into Ferris and Holt and was reminded, not by law, not by violence, but by posture and policy, that some doors may open but remain unwelcoming. In that time, the world did what it always does when truth becomes uncomfortable. It debated it. On cable news, pundits leaned into their talking points like pews in a tired church. Was it racism or a misunderstanding? Was it bias or a breakdown in procedure? But for those over 65, for those who had lived long enough to recognize a wound even when it wore a tie, the answer was not hard. They'd seen this before. In different clothes. Under different names. But the same theater. There had been no slurs. No barking dogs. Just a man asked to move, to wait, to prove, again. And again. And again. Back at the branch, the atmosphere had curdled into something too tense to name. The staff moved like they were underwater, slow, quiet, cautious. Clients arrived and left more quickly now. They no longer lingered in the waiting area. No one joked about espresso machines or downtown traffic. Even the receptionist, once a melody of pleasantries, now answered with flat syllables. Because shame has a sound. And it is silent. Preston Mathers, who had once regarded Tobias as a man out of place, now sat on the other end of the spectrum. Suspended. Disgraced. Alone. He had spent the past days reading articles not written for him, but about him. He had become the face of something older than himself. And while the internet mocked him with memes and nicknames, Preston felt something deeper. He no longer knew who he was when the power was stripped away. But Tobias knew. He had met men like Preston before. Not villains. Just the faithful sons of an idea that never required them to question the soil they grew from. Preston had believed the system was fair because it had always been fair to him. That afternoon, as a public hearing was quietly scheduled by the Financial Ethics Oversight Committee, a new document was filed, an internal review order signed by the Harmonic Trust Initiatives Board. It requested records, client service logs, and flagged interactions going back 5 years. It bore Tobias's name, and it had the weight of legal teeth. But even more striking was what followed. A press statement. 1 page. No theatrics. Just facts. It named no names, but made its target clear. Ferris and Holt Financial has demonstrated a consistent pattern of differential treatment based not on income, account activity, or client status, but on visual profiling and inferred social legitimacy. We do not seek retribution. We seek accountability. And we will build it, policy by policy, protocol by protocol, until fairness no longer needs to be defended. Harmonic Trust Initiative, May 22nd. That night, as it aired across channels and was retweeted by senators and scholars alike, something else happened. A town hall was held, not by the bank, but by the community. In a local auditorium with flickering lights and a broken microphone cord taped with silver, people gathered. Not for spectacle, but for speech. Marissa Lane, the journalist who had first captured the video, sat in the second row, notebook in her lap, recording not facts but emotions, rage, exhaustion, clarity. An older man stood to speak. He wore a fedora and a coat too thin for the weather. "I've seen this before," he said, voice steady. "They told my father he couldn't apply for a home loan. Said it was the zip code. They told my brother he couldn't sit in a college office. Said it was full. They told me I couldn't open a business account. Said they had other options." He paused, then added, "They never said black. They didn't have to." The crowd murmured. Heads nodded. The words felt like gospel. And then, without being asked, Tobias appeared. He entered through the side door. No spotlight. No fanfare. Just presence. He walked to the front and stood behind the podium. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just looked at the room. The faces lined with time. The eyes that had seen too much. The hands that had held protests, funerals, and sometimes, still, hope. When he finally spoke, it was not with fire, but with stillness. "I didn't come to tear down a bank," he said. "I came to see if it was worthy of the community it claimed to serve." A murmur rose. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand anything more than courtesy." And they answered me not with policy, but with presumption. He looked out at them, his voice quieter now. "We don't need apologies written in press releases. We need systems that don't require us to be extraordinary just to be treated as ordinary." The applause was not loud. It was deep. It came from the chest, not the hands. As he stepped away, someone called out, "What happens now?" Tobias paused. "Now," he said, "we build something better." But what he did not say, what he did not need to say, was that they would have to build it not on new ground, but on the broken remnants of trust that had always been denied, stolen, or sold. And in that room, where older men and women sat wrapped in memories that still ached, they felt it. Not resolution, but reckoning. Because the lie of progress is that it moves forward. But the truth, one Tobias Reed had just made the world confront, is that sometimes justice walks in reverse, slowly, patiently, until the walls that claim to protect us are the same ones we must tear down. By the time the sun rose on that final morning, Ferris and Holt was no longer a name spoken with reverence. It had become something else, a metaphor, a lesson, a confession. And Tobias Reed, the man they tried to shepherd quietly out of a lobby, now stood at the center of a conversation they never intended to have. Inside the glass towers of the financial district, memos now began with fear, not pride. Executives met not to plan expansion, but to review compliance. And on every floor, there were whispers of the man who never raised his voice, never threatened, never performed outrage, and yet dismantled their illusion of fairness with nothing more than presence. But justice, Tobias knew, is not victory. Justice is repair. And repair in a nation that has spent centuries building its greatness on the scaffolding of exclusion does not come cheap. It requires that men who have never been questioned begin to interrogate the very architecture of their comfort. That day, a letter arrived at the office of Preston Mathers. He was no longer at the bank. His days were filled now with silence, no calls to return, no clients to court, only the rustle of paper and the ache of regret. The letter was sealed with the harmonic trust insignia. Inside, just one line. "You will attend a 12-week equity immersion program. There will be no cameras. No apologies. Only work." Preston stared at the page, unmoving. There were no lawyers copied, no appeals process, no escape hatch dressed in corporate lingo. He was not being asked. He was being invited into something rarer than exoneration. Understanding. Elsewhere, Tobias stood before the Senate Banking Committee. He wore no lapel pin, no brand, no entourage. Just a dark suit, a black notebook, and the steady gaze of someone who had outlived dismissal. The committee chair, a white man old enough to have marched but not long enough to have listened, cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed, would you care to summarize what happened?" Tobias leaned forward. "No," he said calmly. "I'd like to summarize what always happens." He opened the notebook. "We build institutions to serve the people. But over time, they learn to serve only those who look like their architects. And those of us who do not fit the blueprint, we are either pushed aside or required to prove our worth before being allowed to enter a room we already helped pay for." He paused. "I am not extraordinary because of what I own. I am extraordinary only in that I survived being overlooked long enough to reclaim what should have never been denied." There was no applause. Not in that room. Only silence, the heavy kind. The kind that meant some of them were hearing not just words, but truth. In the weeks that followed, policy reviews swept through the industry. Banks hired equity auditors. Executives stepped down. The term Reed Protocol was coined, used to describe the rapid internal reviews triggered when a client was flagged under questionable discretion. And slowly, the changes began. But Tobias didn't stay to collect thanks. Instead, he returned to the neighborhoods where the bank had never placed branches, to churches whose congregants knew more about dignity than dividends, to high schools where young men in hoodies were taught to lower their eyes instead of raise their ambitions. And in one such auditorium, dusty and unair-conditioned, he stood before a group of teenagers and said, "You will be underestimated. That is not your burden. That is their blindness." A hand rose in the crowd. A boy, barely 17, with the weight of an older man in his eyes. "Why do they hate us?" he asked. Tobias looked at him for a long moment. "They don't hate you," he said softly. "They fear what they never took time to understand. And what they fear, they try to shrink. Your job is not to become small enough to fit their fear. Your job is to become so certain of your worth that their fear has nowhere left to hide." Later that night, Tobias sat alone by a window. No headlines. No cameras. Just memory. He thought of his father, who had never owned a house, but taught him how to own himself. He thought of the men who had stood on courthouse steps and prayed louder than the laws that excluded them. He thought of Baldwin, of Hughes, of Ella Baker, of women and men who had bent this country toward justice, inch by inch, at the cost of everything. He did not feel triumphant. He felt ready. Because racism in America does not die. It adapts. It recedes like smoke, then seeps back in through cracks we forgot to seal. But so, too, must dignity be relentless. So, too, must clarity return, generation after generation, reminding this country not just who we are, but who we refuse to stop becoming. And that is where we leave Tobias Reed. Not as a man who won, but as a man who revealed. A man who stood in a lobby built to deny him, and without shouting, without breaking, without begging, simply reminded the world that power is not what you hold, but what you refuse to surrender. The end.